Okay, hello and welcome to the Nutrition, Health and Performance podcast with me, Jamie Pugh again. I've got another fantastic guest lined up for this chat. So I've got on the other end of the line Gabriel Martins. So Gabriel, if you've not seen him, has an awesome podcast called Fuel the Pedal podcast. So it's aimed more at the sort of cycling performance side of things, but there's so much from there that you can take across performance. So, just recently had Greg Haff on. I think you've had James Morton on, Sam Impey. You've had myself on for one of the episodes. So some unbelievable guests on the podcast. But before we get going, so Gabriel, how are things? And then do you want to just maybe give people that haven't come across you or your work before, give us a little bit of a rundown of the things that you're doing that you've done before?
Hi, Jamie. So first of all, thanks so much for having me in. I'm flattered for your introduction, and you almost forgot the most important guest, which would be yourself. And it was great to have you on as well. And it's a pleasure to be here. So yes, I'm Gabriel. I'm Portuguese, but I am currently working and living in Spain, and that's where I am developing my work and mostly of my research. We are here I integrated a caffeine research group, and it started out like that, but then we went on to research on other substances, other ergogenic substances as well, and I keep on developing my work as a nutritionist, working with cyclists mainly, but with runners as well, mostly in the endurance sports side of things, and trying to keep my podcast alive, Fuel the Pedal. For the moment, it's going well. I can manage to conciliate everything, and that's it.
No, the podcast, honestly, is definitely doing well. Much better than this one. Like I said, we're going to link to it below. Like I said, I can't stress enough, if you've got any interest in nutrition, in science for endurance performance, it's definitely worth going to check out. But so you mentioned there, you said you're in the lab at the minute that has a bit of a focus on ergogenic aids and specifically caffeine. So that's what we were going to focus on mostly today. Like I said, we might go off on a few different tangents, take advantage of having you on while we've got you. So suppose there's so many places we can start with caffeine. It's obviously been so well researched within sports nutrition. But I think the best place to start is how popular is it as a supplement, or how many people, what's the prevalence of use in athletes at the moment?
So it's an important question to start, but I would first start with a disclaimer on this. I am by no means, I appreciate your invitation, Jamie, but I am by no means an expert on caffeine. The true expert is our mentor, Juan Del Coso. He's one of the main researchers in caffeine. The man breathes caffeine. He inhales and exhales caffeine all day, and he should be the person to go to. But I'll try my best to represent him and the research that we're doing. So tell me.
Yeah, as I was going to say, there's a great point. That's an amazing point actually that you bring up before we start. And I say this to all of the students, like lecture students, stuff like that, in that none of us really are experts. We're only taking the research that we see it and present it how we're interpreting it. So no problem. We're not holding you to account or gospel or any of this. But like I said, you are, compared to the rest of us, you are definitely an expert. So no, go on, crack on. Sorry.
I'll try my best to represent Juan and what the research up until so far says about this topic. And yes, talking about the prevalence. So it's no doubt and no question that caffeine is a popular supplement among athletes and among recreational users as well, I might say. Probably in the sense of let's use it as a pre-workout, or let's use it just as in the form of a gel. But we kind of see that people in general don't really know how to take caffeine or how to use it. So we have done a couple of studies here in Spain but one of them with a good database that we had over 500 athletes, and we've tried to see in elite Spanish athletes what they were taking, and we were surprised to see that caffeine was actually one of the least used supplements, and we accounted also for the presence of caffeine in pre-workout formulas. It was really not that common. We're talking about one of the most representative supplements in terms of scientific evidence for its use. We had a lot of proteins, for example, BCAAs and multivitamins usage among athletes, but caffeine was below 5%, and these ones that I just mentioned were way above 30, 35, even 40% in prevalence. So I think that's the current, the general overview on how things are or caffeine is used. It also depends on the type of sport that we are talking about. If we're talking about an endurance sport like cycling, for example, where I'm mostly involved, or running, caffeine, I think it's more popular, or at least the use is a little bit more rational, or at least in pair with the recommendations. These type of athletes know that caffeine is in gels, and they kind of know how to fraction their use throughout the race, if it's a long course race, 2 hours, 3 hours, or even more in the case of cycling. But if we are considering other sports, more strength-based or explosive modalities, caffeine is mostly associated with these pre-workout formulas, and so the effects that we see might be a mix from the other things that we find on pre-workout formulas. So I think this would be the general overview.
And so, do you think? And I haven't managed to get into that study, so you could maybe clear this up. So when you were looking for the prevalence, was that specifically as a supplement? Because obviously, we can maybe get into foods and concentrations that caffeine is found in naturally, but did that account then for things like coffee intake, or were you just looking at if they take it as in supplement form?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We didn't account for it because the questionnaire. We firstly validated the questionnaire, and only after we went on to ask specifically for the supplements. So any things like caffeine drinks, coffee, Cokes, Coca-Cola, any other beverages containing caffeine weren't accounted. So we really don't know. And that's a big handicap to consider here as well. So we were really specifically aiming for the intentional use of caffeine as a supplement, not as a food, let's call it.
Yeah, no, and I think it's still worthwhile though, because like you said, I think we'll come on to doses next. I think this is where this comes into play a little bit, because so like you said, even if within that study people were taking coffee or espressos or whatever Coca-Cola, something like that contain caffeine, because they maybe know of its benefits, but you are sort of rolling the dice a little bit when it comes to dosage in some of those. So I said there are lots of studies, there's lots of data out there already showing that even if you get the same coffee from the same coffee shop from one day to the next, the caffeine amount can be quite different. So the ergogenic effect you're going to get is going to be maybe completely different from one day to the next, or one batch to the next.
Sure.
So in terms of, I think that does move us on to talk about that then. So when it comes to doses, what are the sort of ranges or the optimal doses that people should be looking for?
So this is where I think we've been mostly misunderstanding and misinterpreting the data from caffeine intake, because when we talk about caffeine, the athletes and people in general automatically think and associate with coffee. Okay, if I drink coffee or an espresso or any caffeine containing drink, I will have a performance benefit. So while we know that in the early days of caffeine research, what was the recommended was the typical 3 to 9 milligrams per kilo. It was always this dose for per kilogram of body weight. Now we know that things are a bit different. We don't need to go over 6 milligrams per kilo, for example, and we even know that doses that are even inferior to 3 milligrams per kilo might actually produce an ergogenic effect. So, and then we can argue, okay, I can obtain that by taking coffee, by taking a cup of espresso. Well, we don't really know the dosage. We don't really know how much coffee is in each espresso. And an espresso in Portugal, I can tell you that is completely different from an espresso in Spain, let alone in the UK or any other part of the world. So that we would lose track a bit of the quantity if you want to really quantify how much per milligram how many milligrams per kilo we wanted to give. So what I think in terms of this applicability is that we have at our disposal, caffeine in other forms in which we can perfectly control the dosage we are giving to the athlete. We have on capsules. Normally, we have capsules containing 200 milligrams of caffeine. That would be roughly around 3 milligrams per kilo, which would be effective for most athletes. That would, of course, we can get into all the timing and duration of the exercise issue. But we even have chewing gums that are much less popular, but the appearance of caffeine in the blood, the pharmacokinetics is much faster. And there are many forms, but especially the formula of the capsule would be a much wiser and much controlled way of giving this to the athlete, or even a powdered form. But yes, so just to summarize everything, what I mean is that yes, we can take a coffee and obtain a benefit, of course, because we know that smaller doses can promote an effect. But if we really want to control how much, then we should really aim for caffeine forms that we know exactly how much caffeine we have in that particular supplement.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a good point. And it's something that, as you said, it surprises me often when I speak to athletes. And it goes back to the study you said at the beginning where, the equivalent is maybe, I don't know, can you imagine if someone did a gym session and then they took a protein shake afterwards, but they didn't really know how much protein was in it. It might be 5 grams of protein, it might be 50 grams. And sure, sometimes maybe not that extreme, but that's what you're doing with a cup of coffee. So especially when it's maybe for training sessions, it's maybe less important, but especially competition, it's always, I've always never really been sure why it's not more popular. So we know for most people, or pretty much everyone, it is ergogenic, depending on once you get the dosage right. And then, like I said, it's not an expensive supplement. It's not like it's difficult to obtain. It's not like I said, there's so many different forms that you can really control the dose. But it's one of those. In terms of then the sports, it is going to be beneficial for, and it is ergogenic for. Is it right across the board, from endurance to strength? Those explosive sorts. Do we see benefits across the range there, or?
Yes. So in terms of when it works or in which kind of activity it works, we went on when there was a really good umbrella review published by Jozo Grigic, and after that we kind of partnered with him to launch a visual infographic to kind of summarize visually what the findings were, and to make an overview of what we know up so far. So, and one of the things that we wanted to highlight in this infographic was exactly that there are certain type of activities or exercise types that are more favored by caffeine ingestion, and most of them we think that for what we see, endurance-based activities and aerobic activities seems to benefit more from caffeine ingestion. There are some lesser but still important effects in repeated high-intensity efforts and muscle endurance as well. Where the effect is less clear is in maximum strength, for example. So we do see that in aerobic type efforts, the effects is good, especially between both genders, because this is something I expect we will get onto as well. Because in both male and females works similarly, but for what we know, all the effect in power in the weight lifted per athlete in sprint performance, it's a little bit less less evident in women. It seems to be a little bit stronger in men, but it is still ergogenic in women. And so I think that's, in terms of the type of exercise, this would be it.
No, that's some good information there. Like you said, it is difficult. It's not one size fits all, and some of the stuff, especially there on the max strength, is interesting. What do you think? That's a case of study design, or do you think it's maybe the mechanism behind? I know we're not really gone into that in a lot of detail, but what do you think is the reason for that? Then why there appears to be less of an effect for those max strength type efforts?
You mean in terms of gender?
Yeah.
So I think we still have a gap between the research in male and female athletes, just in many other fields, not just in caffeine. We are starting to see this over and over in many papers that are coming out now. Many of the studies we have on exercise, on ergogenic aids, on even protein, or even on carbohydrate, are mostly done in male athletes and with the male population. But we are not comparing the same amount of studies in both genders. So that would be one of the main things, in my opinion. It's not a fair comparison, and the reason why it's really out of my field of expertise. But yes, I think the studies are less and underpowered. I still want to see more research done with women to fairly answer you and give you a proper answer of because there are a lot less studies in women. This is the truth, especially in speed and muscle power, which was something we did a letter to the editor in Nutrients about this. And we found out some gaps. For example, there are no studies with female athletes and caffeine under 1 milligram per kilo. There are no studies with female athletes over 9 milligrams per kilo. And in terms of the type of exercise, speed and muscle power are really, really underrepresented in women. So this is why I can't give you an answer, because the comparison is just not possible at this moment.
No, and like I said, I think it's still a valid point to raise, isn't it? Like, often with research, it's not a case of because the evidence isn't there, we shouldn't do something, or it's clear cut. Research needs to catch up with practice. So, like I said, maybe once there's a little bit more research in that area, we'll have a better understanding. Just to come back to some of the specifics and the practicalities, then. So we've mentioned the dose a little bit. The first part of that I meant to ask, is what time period are we talking there as well? How soon before exercise, or is it during exercise? When's the sort of best time to take that on?
Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't mention, that I'm glad that you came back to this initial point, is that caffeine is the response to caffeine intake is it varies dramatically over different individuals, and there are many reasons for this. Some of them the research is only starting to emerge now. It's maybe related to genetic variations. But we are talking about caffeine is an interesting substance because it can vary from highly ergogenic to even ergolytic in some individuals.
Yeah.
So not only the dose, but the predisposition that you have for anxiety, or especially the race day nervousness that you may have, or even the sleep impairment that you may have with caffeine ingestion, are all things that you need to consider. So if I have a cycling team or even a football team, I can give different amounts of caffeine to each one of them according to the things these traits that I've just mentioned. That I know that this athlete is usually more nervous before a match or before a race, and perhaps is not going to be, if he's a climber, of his role in the race, assuming cycling, for example, is not going to be as important. He's going just to stay behind. Is not going to do so much work on the mountains. Maybe I will give him a different dose of caffeine, or I will just fraction it throughout the race. So these are all things that need to be considered in my opinion. Then about the timing. So the timing, if we go for how fast caffeine is absorbed by our body. So the peak is normally at 60 minutes. So normally the recommendations are to 45 to 60 minutes. From 15 minutes, we can start to see a rise in caffeine in the blood. But again, I really think this is really sport specific and individual specific, because if I know, for example, that I need to make sure on the day after that the athlete is as it's in its best way, and I know that in that particular athlete it might impair sleep, I might try to concentrate caffeine on the early part of the day. So I will try to focus everything on the pre-workout dose, on the pre-exercise dose or pre-race dose, and however we want to call it. So I could aim for example, a 3 milligram per kilo dose, which would be roughly the 200 milligrams, and then avoid giving that athlete throughout the race, because I know that the later he takes caffeine, so the more likely he is to get his sleep impaired. Still, if there is another athlete who has no problems with it, so I can aim for a smaller dose, probably just give him an espresso before, and then give him several gels throughout the race until I reach the 3 or even the 6 milligram per kilo range. I can give him to him that dose, and it would be different from the other one. So I think these are things to consider from what my short experience is dealing with these athletes. Really individual doses, and athletes and coaches should really try to experiment with different protocols to see what's the best match for them.
Yeah, and like you said, as you're saying that, it brings up two really good examples of what you're saying there. So the first was a paper that I've seen. I only saw the headline this morning, so I haven't read the study details. But it showed that in middle distance running, there was no ergogenic effect on average, but it did affect sleep quality during late evening competition. So you said, so in that instance, even if it wasn't ergolytic to performance that night, it is having a negative overall effect when it's affecting sleep. And one of the practical examples of that was, I can't remember the football team, but there was a football match that got postponed. It might have been an England international. It got postponed. It was an evening game, really late on before kickoff, and that was one of the big comments, with the athletes that had maybe then taken caffeine supplements or something like that, ready for the game, but then actually they don't manage to sort of metabolize it as quickly. So it's, like you said, they're all things that you need to consider. One of the things that you mentioned there, which is certainly relevant to the sport you're most interested in, cycling, is then, so not just taking caffeine pre-workout or pre-competition, but during exercise as well. So I guess the longer the exercise is, the more opportunity there is to take on caffeine. So first of all, for any of those longer distances, is there an added benefit of taking caffeine in during competition?
Yes, I think it seems to be the research is out there. So there is research comparing the effects of giving pre-workout the same dose pre-workout or pre-exercise or pre-race, and then giving the same dose fractioned over time, and the effects are quite similar. The same effects in performance in time trial performance. So I think yes. It all depends, as I said. I think it all depends, or it depends on the nature of the race and the nature of the conditions you have around you. The role of that rider, for example, in the race is crucial. So you normally see in cycling races, you see them using that one of the last caffeine gels they have, that one final gel that they have. Usually it's a caffeine one. So I think it is. Sometimes we even in cycling see something interesting, which is the small can of Coke. And yes, it's another form of a really popular form of using caffeine in a much smaller dose, of course, because we are considering in the regular can of Coke you have 30 milligrams, and then on that small can you will have an inferior amount. But nonetheless, it's one of those examples in which you may have a gel before, then you have a can of Coke, then you have another gel. It's the sum of all the small doses and the fraction doses of caffeine that appears to do that effect, and there is research to back it up. Another thing that's important with caffeine is that there is also a huge belief effect associated. Well, we have it with probably all supplements, but there is specific research on the placebo effect with caffeine, and when subjects are informed or they can identify that they took caffeine, they had a superior performance in that kind of trial. So just the fact that they know they are taking caffeine really seems to produce an added effect. So, but this is just something to add on to the research and to the effects, because the effect without the placebo effect, it's still there. But if they also believe that there is this added benefit, so it can also provide it some added effect as well.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think that belief is huge, because I think you also see that on the flip side as well, on the ergolytic or the negative side of things. I know a few athletes who have sort of made their mind up that they don't want to take caffeine on because they think it gives them the jitters, or they think that it's negative to their performance. So there has always been a part of me that would almost love to test it and maybe give them a placebo in training to see if they still think that, oh no, that was really, that was a rubbish training session, or was so you could almost then show to them, actually you didn't have caffeine this time. It's not something I've actually done yet, but it's something that I've thought about a few times, because especially with some of the runners I've worked with, like you said, you do get these strong positive beliefs that it will be beneficial to performance, and then also this strong belief sometimes that it's negative to their performance.
Yeah, if you allow me, Jamie.
Yeah, go on.
Just to complement what you just said, it's almost a paradox, because on one side we have some athletes that that they have this belief effect, and they really believe that caffeine is doing something, and they have this placebo effect associated with caffeine. But on the other side, we see a reality, at least the experience I have with both runners and cyclists, is that they still fear taking caffeine. And what we see from our Prevalence study was exactly that some of them we talked to them, and afterwards, after the study came out, and they really we talked about caffeine and everything, and they just told us that I know I feared it. I'm afraid of the effects of caffeine. I think it's going to be too much. I think, but then they took pre-workout formulas. When we compared, okay, but how about you take the caffeine by itself and the caffeine in the supplement? It can be the same amount as in the pre-workout, but they just don't look to the pre-workout in that way. They just look at it as a mix of the substances from they know or they may not know how much caffeine is in there. So there's still this fear, I think, in some athletes, endurance and recreational alike, of using caffeine. Paradoxically, with the other ones who really believe that it's going to be explosive to their performance. So it's a curious reality we have with caffeine.
Yeah, massively. And like I said, especially, but there are then people who will happily drink a coffee or an espresso before training, but not take caffeine. It's almost as if they can't differentiate the two. Like I said, almost as if the supplement is going to be this huge mega dose, whereas a coffee is something that is manageable. So even that, I sometimes I can't quite get my head around it. Like I said, there's definitely this. I don't know what the word is, but yeah, there's definitely these connotations that go along with caffeine supplements for some people.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So the next bit I want to get to then is sort of in terms of it's difficult to sort of classify people as responders or non-responders. I know you've already touched on some of the genetic research that's coming out. I think it's Nancy Guest and others that have maybe published some of that work. But is there something that so moving away from the belief factor, is there true physiological differences in people's responses to caffeine, and then to sort of follow that up? The other thing that I think a lot of people want to know is, do you become habituated to it? So those who are maybe regularly drinking coffee, things like that, do you then start to become habituated to the effects of caffeine?
Mm-hmm. So those are really two important points that we wanted to include on our infographic as well when doing all the visual summary. About the first point about responders and non-responders, and this is a terminology that I think it became really much overused and started out. I think I started hearing about this with creatine, that we were responders and non-responders to creatine, and then the same started to be applied to caffeine as well. What our lab, I didn't integrate this this research. It was my mentor Juan Del Coso who did most of them. I only started out as being part of the research group after this research came to be. So they tried to study this effects, and what they found, they used some genetic markers as well, and what they found is that we cannot say that there are non-responders to caffeine. What we can say is there are people that on a specific day, on a specific condition, they for some reason did not respond. So they introduced this topic of did not respond. It's not that they are non-responders always. Yeah. There are situations or days or specific conditions in which they may not respond, and they can respond as well, but in different magnitudes. So I think for one side that's what happens, and that would be the current and probably the most correct terminology to apply. There are high responders. That's what we use this on the infographic to summarize what we know about this. There are high responders and low responders. And the responses may vary inter and intra individuals. So this from one side. About habituation to caffeine, there was an interesting study published by our research group as well. And what they saw is that after 20 days of providing the same amount of caffeine every day for 20 days, and then they did several time trials to try and study performance throughout the experiment. So chronic dose of 3 milligrams per kilo, we saw that after these 20 days, there was still a performance benefit. There was still an ergogenic effect. A little smaller, of course. The bigger the effect was bigger in the first day, and then on the last day it was gradually smaller. But it's not as drastically decreased as we may thought before. And we've tried to represent this in the infographic. We designed some bars, and the previous idea we had is that the bars by the 5th or 6th day that the performance effect would disappear. But no, what happens is that it's a small decrease, but the effect is still out there. I will then just throw a caveat here to say that This is probably not the situation with most athletes. I don't think most athletes are taking 3 milligrams per kilo every day for 20 days. Probably we want to know this in the context of, okay, what happens if I take an espresso today, then tomorrow, and then the next day I may not take one. But if I take some coffee, for example, socially, and then if I reach the weekend and I compete, what happens if I take 3 milligrams per kilo, if I take my 200 milligram capsule? I think from the data we have available that we still have an effect, but we still don't have research quantifying exactly what happens with having smaller doses and then happen to have a pre-race dose that it's much higher than this usual dose we have throughout the week. But I think the effect would still be there, and it would be perhaps wise to avoid caffeine, I think, on the day before, on the 2 days before, if you can. But I don't think it would be that much conditioned if you take, if you have a couple of espressos throughout the week, and then you go on at the end of the week to compete, and you have your pre-exercise capsule. I don't think it's going to affect. So there is some times where we have to distinguish between what is done in the lab and what is the context in which we want to apply it. And we are not taking 3 milligrams every day, but still we need to try and do this game of contextualization. But I still think that probably, just to sum it all up, is that we can probably abstain from coffee the day before, but we can still enjoy our espressos throughout the week without many concerns about ergogenic dose working or not before exercise on the weekend.
I think people will definitely be happy to hear that. They don't need to cut the coffees out completely. And no, what you're saying there, it's good because it puts a bit of confidence back into like some of the reading I've done and some of the practices that I carry out with athletes. And it's exactly that you said. It's not that every training session I'm suggesting that they take pre-workouts or caffeine supplements. Sometimes it is a case of, okay, if they've got a fasted training run to do in the morning, or they've got an interval session that afternoon, it might just be a timed coffee before, because it gives them that belief effect that they've had something to maybe perk them up for training. And then when it comes to competition, I know that it's not having a negative effect. They're not becoming completely habituated to it, but also they're probably going to be getting a bigger dose anyway, when it's then a supplement that we prescribe, either as you said at the start, the chewing gums or the capsules, something that we can measure and control. We know is probably slightly higher than what they would get in their daily coffee anyway.
Yeah, and I think in one phrase or one quote, if you'd like, that I'm really getting used to saying in the podcast lately, is that everything in this life needs to be quantified, especially nutrition. Everything needs to be quantified. Without quantification, we are lost, because it's because of our lack of quantifying things that everything is good and then everything is bad. Everything is healthy for you. Anything can be unhealthy for you, or kill you, or cause you some disease, or just work wonders, or it really doesn't work. No, everything needs to be quantified. And with caffeine, that's really one substance that I think this quote may really apply.
100%. And it reminds me of, I won't name the university, but there was a story a couple of years ago, and this is maybe where it's important as well to get your units correct for measurement. So I think it was, instead of 20 milligrams of caffeine, or around about that, they prescribed 20 grams of caffeine.
Yes.
And
yes,
that was a very dangerous situation for the
heard
students that took that dose. So as I said, that's on the very extreme end, but maybe in terms of what is still, like I said, it's not especially extreme, but maybe higher amounts of caffeine. Is there a sort of, because as you said, a lot of people, if they think something's good, more is better. Does the safety limit, if you like, start to be drawn? What sort of dosages would you normally be looking at there?
So I think by now it's pretty much safe to assume that it's around 400 milligrams per day. but it's what the EFSA in Europe established as the upper limit. This would be probably roughly around or closer to 6 milligrams per kilo, and it's exactly where coincidentally we see that there is no increment in performance. So we know that from 3 to 6, getting closer to 6, we really don't see that much of an increased effect. So and from that dose, I would say that it could also be, I would say, no, I don't want to say dangerous, but it's one of those symptoms that we often wrongly associate caffeine with, even smaller doses, the anxiety, the insomnia, compromising sleep quality. Even in some patients, we could see higher risk of hypertension. This would be observed, but yeah, I think that the dose really needs to be considered, really needs to be quantified, and I don't think there's a reason for now to take over 6 milligrams per kilo. I think the research now is really getting towards this dosage of between 3 and 6 milligrams per kilo.
No, that I think I definitely agree with that. I definitely resonate that. That's really good information. I am just conscious of the time here, so I think we'll start to wrap this up. The only other thing I wanted to say was that, first of all, is there anything you wanted to touch on, anything that we maybe missed or you think that we've missed?
No, I think we've pretty much summarized what's out there now and what the latest research is on caffeine. I think probably if we had to give some take home messages, would be just to insist on first of all, not to fear caffeine, and really try to aim and quantify the dose according to your body weight, and really advise coaches and nutrition colleagues to experiment with these different protocols. We can even aim to try with just a cup of espresso before, see how you feel, then progressively move towards having a much higher dose, or the 3 milligram per kilo before your race or before your workout. Of course, always before experiments during training and not during racing. This would be I think it's the first rule of any in the sports nutrition realm, and I think that would be it. And then take into consideration, if you're into cycling or running, to consider inter-racing or a fraction dosage throughout the race, to see how you feel. If it's a really shorter session, like a time trial, for example, yes, then you wouldn't be allowed to take your hands off the handlebars. So you have to consider the pre-workout dose. So this is one context that would be really specific, and the pre-workout and the pre-exercise would be the most recommended one. So yes, from all the supplements that are out there, before considering many other stuff that I won't even mention, caffeine alongside with creatine, for example, I consider that are the two top supplements that we have nowadays with the most research to back it up. And with caffeine, we are talking about a substance that is has been researched in the past century, and over 100 years of research to back it up. It's just a matter of quantifying it and find out what's the best protocol that works for you.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic summary there. Some really good practical take homes, and as you said, especially just the amount of research there is. I think it's quite surprising that how little considered some caffeine sometimes is. So I think it's great points. Before we wrap this up, we've already plugged the podcast, which I'll do again. Fuel the Pedal is unbelievable podcast. It's definitely one of those that I've got it on the favorite list, and as soon as I see an episode, I know it's going to be good. Other than that, where can people reach out to you on social media or anything like that?
So yes, I mostly use my Fuel the Pedal account. So on Twitter, it will be @FuelThePedal. Mine's also have an Instagram account for Fuel the Pedal. In case you want to follow me there as well. Facebook, I don't use it that much, but in case you want to get in contact through email, I would be happy to reply to you and to consider your email. It's at cycling@fuelthepedal.com, and that's it.
And that's it. That is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that. If people do have any questions, I said comment on any way you see this podcast put out, and if we see them in the next couple of weeks, we'll try and get them to Gabriel, and we'll get some answers for you as well. Other than that, thank you everyone for listening, and we will catch you soon.